Hi, I'm BB Miniatures and welcome to my latest tutorial on how to paint a Sons of Horus Space Marine set in the Warhammer 30k universe. Right here, as we're going to be starting with the airbrush and laying down the green that we'll be using for the project. If you would like to see a more detailed video, please stick around to the end, as you'll see how I come up with the mixture and the methods that I use to create custom colors, or more of a workflow. For your recipes, the colors that I'm using here is a mixture of probably 2 parts of Phalo green from Kimera to 1 part of ocean blue from AK, as well as some black. And after we get this mixture, then we just want to add an equal parts of acrylic thinner. In this case, I used AK's 3rd generation acrylic thinner. Running through the airbrush, and we just need to prime the whole model. Just going nice and smooth, nice and easy all the way through the miniature. And I give this about 2 thin coats. The first coat just because we want to lay down a foundation where some of the primer will still show through. And then the second one is just to give a little more opacity. Just a general rule, and keep in mind when you're using the airbrush, even on these early stages, it's very easy to get carried away. A good rule of thumb is once you see an area that is wet from the paint, just let that dry, or better yet, you can always use your airbrush and just run air through the brush without any paint by pulling back, and you can just dry the area quicker. Or better yet, of course, if you're using this method to paint a whole squad of Space Marines, you can just put down the model and just go right to the second one. Of course, with assembly, if you notice I didn't have the bolter in there, don't forget it. It's very handy, especially just at least to keep the bolter off the model when you're doing this. That way that with our other airbrush layers, we can easily have access to the chest, which is commonly blocked by the bolter in its current grip. After I've done the first layer, here you go, I'm just doing the second one and just speeding through the process. Throughout the video, there will be certain parts that will be sped up, so just look at the top right and I have an indicator. Now with the airbrush, with the first layer done, now I'm going to start applying highlights. The white fill that you see in there is another way that you can thin your paints with your airbrush. Since I'll be doing thinner layers on top of this one, and with a subsequently lighter version of the base coat, instead of adding black, we can start to just use the base of ocean blue, phalo green, and instead now I start adding a little bit of pastel yellow into the mix to start gaining my highlights. The other mix that I put in there, the initial white stuff, is from Hazonga Magic Mix. It's very much a glaze medium that I'm applying in there, as well as I'm applying some acrylic thinner. The reason why I am applying the Magic Mix is that when we're making thinner coats with the highlights of the airbrush, sometimes you have a tendency to going too thin, and it's very hard for the paint to actually stick when it hits the model of the surface. The Hazonga Magic Mix makes the paint a little more thicker, and therefore it's easier for the paint to adhere, but it still thins it out, is because we are placing another medium in there besides pigment. So we still get the same lighter mark, but we make the paint just a little bit thicker so it grips and we have a less chance of spidering when we're hitting the surface. Pairing this with the airbrush that I'm currently using, which is a Harder Steinbach Evolution with a 0.4 needle, I found that this airbrush works better at higher pressures. So the Hazonga Magic Mix really helps because I have to fire this at around almost at 2 bars. This test pattern, of course, you can see exactly what I mean by spidering. Of course, I was spraying that on a silicone mat, so there's absolutely no grip. So it really accentuates that undesired effect that we don't want to run into on the model. So as we start highlighting the model, we want to keep a few things in mind. First off is how we place the light placement on the model. We want to make it so that the light appears to be falling from above. This gives it a natural sense that, most light sources are coming from above the model or to the sides. So we want to always keep our airbrush generally at above a 90 degree, above the horizon that's spraying downwards. Two is that it's always a general idea to look at each part of the model, so each part of his appendage, so his shoulders, his arms, his torso, head, legs and knees, and his backpack. If we want to break those down to general shapes, our shoulders and our heads are giant spheres or half spheres, as well as the arms and legs and even the chest are very cylindrical in shape. So what we generally want to do is place these highlights that accentuate those shapes the best as we can, so we can keep we can make as large as volumes as possible. If anything, it also helps by placing your model under a lamp, and you can kind of generally see where the light falls, and we can use that as a guide as well. The second part, of course, is when you're highlighting with the airbrush and with this paint mixture, if you at least kept to the same rule of like 1 part paint to 1 part thinner. In this case, I added a little bit more thinner, so it's almost like 2 parts thinner to 1 part paint mixture. The first layer is not going to show very strongly, and this is good. What I'm always looking for when I'm highlighting with the airbrush at the beginning is more of the area that is wet, because I know that it's going to take a couple of layers in order to build the opacity that is needed to actually see the actual highlight color. Since the paint is so thin, the majority of the first coat of green is showing through that first layer, so it barely shows. But as I'm starting here to add the second layer of the same highlight, you can notice we're starting to gain in opacity. Just keeping the trigger nice and light. And if you notice, the spray pattern in my airbrush now is getting closer to the subject. Keep in mind, the closer we get with the airbrush, the more tighter the pattern is, as well as the edges where the pattern lays gets a little bit harder. The further you are away from the subject, the pattern will get bigger, and then the edges along the side get a lot less defined. Here's a second stage highlight. In this case, I've just added a little more pastel yellow into the mix. But other than that, it's the same, very similar to 2 to 1. If you notice, you see a little bit extra buildup, which I almost got on the head there, and you notice there's a little bit too much, the area is a little too wet. You should stop immediately. Don't try to maneuver the paint anyway. Well, you can't, but just let it dry. As well as if you notice, after a layer, you should always let the area dry, and you can actually see that the paint actually starts to dull down a little bit. In most all cases with paint, when the paint is wet, it's always going to look brighter than when it dries. This is just a little bit of effect it has when an area is wet, and wet areas tend to reflect more light. So once it dries, you can actually see it calm down a little bit, and some things that you think of that are really big mistakes are actually very, very minor or don't even show up at all. As well as per highlighting, we're just respecting the previous layer, and I'm just trying to paint a little bit inside each of the highlighted zones that I'm doing. A note to help you highlight the face and the chest area, it's a good idea to first take a look at the positioning of the model. In this case, the model's looking over his left shoulder as he's holding his bolter, and it leaves the right side of his model, of his chest, more open. In this case, that's where I want most of the light to gather, is on the right side. That way that we can make the chest look more barreled, look more rounded, as well as the helmet, which comes to a nice point down the center of the helm. If we want the helm and to accentuate that sharper edge, a good idea is to illuminate one side a little bit stronger to show the key light there, leave a shadow gap after it passes the center fold, and then to continue the highlight on the left side. This is a very loose representation of what you could take through portrait painting, or in this case you can always search up a keyword of like Rembrandt lighting. Rembrandt was very known to highlighting the face, like a 3/4 light that allows the subject to be lit 2/3 of the property, but 1/3 of it on the far right side is more left in shadow. It gives it a bit of a mood, as well as, in this case for the Space Marine helmet, it really accentuates the frontward pointiness and the shape of the helm a little bit more, rather if you just brought light to all sides of the helmet equally. Here's a really good example of me not only highlighting the knee, so giving a nice rounded highlight, focusing the light near the top of the left of the knee, but also drawing that line to get a cylinder, the exact shape of his leg, bringing the light there. Notice for these small highlights, it's just really small trigger pulls, and I'm never painting with the airbrush fully open. A little good habit to help you get these controlled bursts is by practicing on a spare piece of paper. What you really want to do is to get the muscle control and the muscle memory of how far you need to pull the trigger back in order just to get a sliver of paint with the start of an actual pattern to be laid down on the piece of paper. Getting that motion and getting that stoppage point will help you get the finer trigger control, so you can just lay down small lines. If you open this up any larger, when you're very blunt or very rude, you're just going to flood the whole area. Again, I just focus the highlight down the middle of the leg and trying to leave a little bit of gap in between the left and the right sides, much like highlighting a cylinder. Another thing you can do to help you gain confidence with making these small highlights with an airbrush is a little bit of visualization, as well as hitting the area just with air. I know this sounds kind of funny, but at the same time, think of it as much like a golf swing or a practice swing. You're using practice strokes with an airbrush, just getting to feel the air and the trigger that you're depressing without actually firing off any paint. That way you can kind of visualize where you want to put the paint, and when you actually go to paint, you can build a little more confidence, as well as you could see how accurate your prediction is compared to your actual attempt. And with such a light mixture with paint, if you're painting with the very thin mixture that I recommend, little mistakes are not so punishing. You might be off by a millimeter or so, but you can quickly make the correction and get to the shape that you need. As well as when you're doing these little highlighted shapes, it's always a general idea to start in the very middle of the shape, and then you can always make it bigger. I never like to paint the outline of a shape, because when you lay that down, that is the size that it has to be. You can't get any smaller. Where if you start in the very middle, it's always easier to create something larger. You can always go over again and again and just make the shape just a little bit bigger each time until you get to the desired highlight shape that you need. just a little note and a reminder for you is that we're still using the same highlight color. This is because that we've kept the airbrush paint so thin is that each subsequent layer that we add on top gains in opacity. We can use this to our advantage, as after one layer dries, we can paint another subsequent layer, and in this case, I'm just making the area even smaller with each layer. That way we can still gain in opacity, and we can gain in value so it goes brighter while still keeping the same paint. It's nice because we don't have to keep making a million highlight colors in our airbrush. We can make a lot less in mixtures but still get more of a dynamic range out of them. Now I've started to add some white into this highlight mix, and again, same mixture, same thinness, even using some of the Hazonga magic mix as well to help give the paint some grip. But now we're going to be focusing the highlights mainly on the upper parts of the model. The nice thing about doing these stages and at the very end, if we keep these max highlights near the top of the model, it also gives us the illusion that the Space Marine is taller. As light falls, it gets diffused as it goes down the model. So don't run into the temptation of over highlighting all of the model. We can mostly focus the majority of these highlights at the top and hit little parts that are sticking out. For instance, maybe a kneecap or a toe that's sticking out a little bit. But other than that, we want to keep it to the top sides of the shoulders, the head, the arms, and the backpack. And there's a final shot of the highlights. As you can see, the majority of those max highlights with a mixture of white are not really present below his waist. Now with all the highlights complete, now we're on to the shadows. Again, the same mixture. We've been putting the Hazonga magic mix with some AK acrylic thinner, as well as I've added a couple of drops of AK's ultramatte varnish. That's just an optional thing, but it'll help me because the paints I'm going to be using, they have a little bit of a satin finish to them, as I notice, and I want to keep them pretty matte, as well as it helps me when the paint dries and I look, I can actually see the light volumes better, or in this case, the shadows. The shadows, we're going to be using a mixture of Witch Purple from a Vallejo model color from the collaboration they did with Nocturna, as well as Vallejo's model air color Hex Lichen. These two paints, these two purples I'll be mixing together, and we're going to apply these in the shadows. Again, when we're going to be doing the shadow work, I'm going to be making more of a thick glaze mixture with the airbrush. This is so that we keep this paint really, really thin and it doesn't stain super hard. Because we also have to watch out, since we're going to be painting with a lower value color, it's very easy to corrupt the higher values that we've already laid down with our highlights. Angling the airbrush will be paramount because we want to get into the shadows, so a general rule of thumb is we never want to spray from above, we always want to spray from below. And to get these small parts, we want to aim right at the max shadow, so I'm going to aim at the very, very bottom of the shoulder blade, the shoulder guard, and again, like I said, start in the lower or the middle part of your shape, and then you can make it bigger as necessary. In terms of order of operation, feel free to change this and you can try doing the shadows first and then doing the highlights. It's more of a personal preference, but for myself, I find that doing the highlights, it will help me gauge the shadows better. When I first if I just put this purple right down against almost a black primer, it's very hard to see much of a shape of anything. On the contrary, you might feel that would be more comfortable to do, since you can almost base coat the whole model in this purple and then start laying down your highlights with the green. Really, it's like a personal preference, but there's no wrong answer. Just for this demonstration and for this tutorial, I've decided to do it in this order. Again, keeping that trigger control light. And if you noticed, even with the thinness of this paint, which is almost like 3 parts thinner to 1 part paint, it still stains a lot. Take a look how I've noticed how I started to add shadows to the sides of the legs on the either side of those highlights. You can also use this time when we're doing the shadow work to minorly correct any shapes that you've made, any errors you've made during the highlight stage. Here I put shadow on the back of the head, this way that we get a good sense of direction and a good sense of shape on the head as well. And I airbrush a shadow on the right side of his face. Remember how the notes I was talking about on the type of like the 3/4 lighting and accentuating one side and separating the 2 sources of light from the left and the right with a strong shadow running down the right side of his face. And how I've added a little more highlight to the left side of the model's chest, leaving the right side more open. Again, it's just more of a posture position, since the right side of his chest is much more open. It's much more open facing to the rest because he's looking to the left. So that is the end of the airbrush stage with the highlights and shadows in place. I'll give you guys a few images from the left and the right side of the model to gain some reference from. After you let that dry, we will quickly get some black and start black lining all the areas that we want on the model, as you guys see here. Any black will do, nothing special. And we're going to prep this for decals. So if you looked at the shoulder blade here and his arm guard here, I have taken with a brush, I've gloss varnished that in preparation for decals. Decals we're going to be using from the Forge World Sons of Horus transfer sheet. When cutting these out, just try to get as close to the shape as possible, without of course cutting into the detail. Taking a couple of pieces that you want and putting a little pool of water. You can do it in a dish. I just put it directly onto the mat that I have here, and I just place the decals right on above. I let these soak for 2 to 3 minutes, and we're going to be grabbing 2 products that I like to use, Micro Set and Micro Sol. The best general course is use the blue, then we switch to the red. The blue is kind of like the general glue that happens, that preps the area. So as you see, I'm just going to put a thin layer of the blue down where I want the decal to go. Use a set of tweezers. And if you've been letting the decal kind of like sit there and soak, it doesn't have to be submerged. You can just sit on top of the pool of water and eventually it'll be released. And you can just take it carefully with a set of tweezers and place it down on there. I like to use a modeling knife and point the blade away from the model, just because it has a good amount of grip. It's a very, very small surface area to touch it and move it around. Just make sure you don't push in and slice. Again, I'm just going to grab a little bit more of the blue. I wipe off the excess so the brush is moist, it's not dripping. And I just gently brush it on top of the decal as well, letting the blue bottle stuff just soak it in, so you kind of give it a bit of a sandwich. I shifted it around when I did that, so I'm just gonna move it around ever so slightly. Don't feel that you need to really rush decals. They can always be a little bit tricky to get in positions, but if you ever run into any problems, the blue stuff is great, is even if you think the area is dry and the decal can't really be moved with your modeling knife, or in this case, a little Q-tip, you can always get the blue stuff. So get some of it on your brush it on top of the decal, and it actually it will actually loosen the decal, and therefore you can move it around again, reset it, or if you really don't like it there, you can just completely take it off. And here I'm just gonna speed up the video a little bit and just put on the one on the right. You do not have to worry about laying this completely flat, especially on very curved surfaces of like Space Marine shoulder pads. This is where the red stuff, the micro sol, really comes into hand, is that this is more of a softening agent. So it smells like vinegar. I don't know if you could actually use vinegar, maybe you can, but we're gonna take the same amount of red stuff, apply it on the brush, just like the blue, and we're gonna gently like brush on top of the other layer. The blue should be allowed to sit for about maybe a minute or two to just to let it dry a little bit, or you can use a Q-tip to, you know, absorb any excess microset or microsol. And now you see here, I'm just applying some of the red stuff on top of the decal. Again, you know, it happens, you know, the decal moves when you put the stuff on, but as long as it's generally in place, we can always use the modeling knife or like a Q-tip or something to move it into its final position for letting it dry. See, if you don't do my mistake, the closer you can cut around the decal, the less of the clear part of the transfer that you need to settle it in. So it does pay a little bit extra if you can get very close to the cutting of the shape. And there's your decals, not very hard. Here's where I start the freehand of the shoulder pad. So in the Sons of Horus, they have these kind of gang markings they have from Chthoniya, and they're they're very crude and very simple. They're just almost like just straight jagged lines in an interesting pattern with some arrows and or little glyphs. I'm using the reference from the transfer sheet and the various book one. Actually, almost all the books have, all the black books in the Horus Heresy have images of Sons of Horus Marines in one way or another, and I'm just going to use them as a loose reference to draw my own pattern. I could have easily used a transfer, but I found that most of the transfers kind of looked more for vehicles rather than the infantry. But with the simplicity of the lines, I thought it won't be too hard just to draw a few straight lines and come up with my own design. The paints I have on the top left, if you want to copy the exact color, is a Rhinox Hide, a Morfang Brown, and the Pastel Yellow. So you just lay down a first line with the Rhinox Hide. The paints are roughly mixed around at 50-50. A very similar paint consistency, especially with the other videos if you've been following. This just allows me to make a good enough mark, but allows the paint for the brush to flow a lot easier. As well as if you make any mistakes, it's easier to rub out. Painting straight lines is there's a few simple tricks to painting lines. It's more just on confidence. I always want to paint in the most comfortable stroke you're in, the most accurate stroke you're in. So for me, I know that's from my left to my right, and maybe going a little bit upwards on the stroke. For you, it might be different, but it's a good thing to pay attention to yourself and listen to how what is your most accurate position. Get comfortable, and when you're painting a straight line, it also helps to, again, visualize where your line wants to start and where it wants to end. And when you paint the straight line, just kind of just go and just commit to it. It's mostly just about commitment and getting over your nerves. I would say the only thing that is a little bit, it could be a little bit nerve-wracking freehanding on top of these shoulder plaids, is that the underlayer that we have is airbrushed. So in order to erase or to fix our mistakes, we either have to quickly rinse our brush with water and then rub out the paint, or B, we have to mix the exact color match of the Sons of Horus Green that we've created and erase it by using that color as a rubber and cutting back. You'll never get the exact same finish that you have with the airbrush with your brush because they make different markings. So when doing this, you just want to feel a little more confident, and don't drink too much espresso before you do this, like I actually did during this session. It was a bit of a mistake, but I can't always afford to, stop painting in the middle of the day for like 2 hours. So after I do those a few designs on top of that shoulder pad, then I'm just gonna add some little fun tally marks, maybe a little personal kill counter on how many loyalist dogs he's killed. Or maybe these are markings of Xenos before the real heresy began. Who knows? Now into the highlights. So now I mix the Rhinox Hide. I do around I make a bridge, so it's around like a 50-50 mix between Rhinox Hide and Morphang Brown, or you could go straight up to Morphang Brown and start painting directly on top of these lines. Now, make a note that these gang symbols on here are not actually like cuts into the armor, even though that actually sounds kind of cool when I talk about it now, but at the time when I'm painting them, I'm thinking these gang markings are actually done with like really like crude paint that the Astartes have on board or something like that. So they're not actually like illustrated cuts. The thing is, when we're highlighting them, a really good guide that you can use to where the highlights begin is taking a look at how you've highlighted the shoulder pad during the airbrush stage. If anything, you should be using that as the guide, is the exact placement on your highlights on your freehand. That way that the shoulder pad looks like it's uniformly lit from a unified source, rather than a sporadic source that doesn't really make much sense. So you can see I'm just gathering the highlights closer and closer towards the actual light that I've created with the airbrush. And in that final mix, I just added some of the pastel yellow. Now moving on to the pin wash oil stage, I have to me this blood red and some ivory black. I'm going to put this into a metal dish, and then we're going to be adding some white spirits into making a wash consistency. The great thing with oils is that it'll greatly speed it up, as well as it's very forgiving medium to use, so any mistakes are easily rubbed out. Really awesome especially if you're doing a whole squad or a whole army. this is it's a great tool and it's a good trick to have. Mixing the paint here in the dish, you can kind of see the consistency that we're aiming for. You really want to make sure this is mixed really well, as the paint and the thinner can easily become separated if not mixed properly or sitting too long. In preparation to this pin wash, we've gloss varnished the whole model and let that dry for a few hours before we apply the pin wash. This will give us reduced surface tension and allow the wash to flow into the crevices and shadows and panel lining recesses. As you can see in this slow motion video, it's just a little gentle touch into an area with our brush loaded that the capillary action will just let it allow it to flow right into all the shading areas. As well as I'm just going to touch each of those rivets to allow a little bit of that wash to surround the rivet to really give a little bit extra detail and punch it out there. As you can see, when I'm going through the model, I'm trying to be as neat as possible, so I have a minimal amount of cleanup and errors to fix. But don't be alarmed if you apply too much, or you just have a little bit of a misfire and you hit the wrong area. The nice thing about oils is they take a long time to dry, and we can just reactivate and manipulate them just with a little bit of thinner. This is what gives this oil pin wash another good characteristic, especially for army painting, is we can go fairly quickly with minimal fear of really ruining a whole model. That way, because when we can activate the oil paint again with some mineral spirits, we can clean up any mistakes that we do. There you can definitely see the advantages of using this oil pin wash on the head, especially in those grill marks. It's very easy just to apply the paint and just allow it to naturally flow. You can also use your brush to manipulate to push it to the area that you want it to go into. Pair that with the gloss varnish that we laid down. It just makes it this section of the shading the model a lot less of a chore if we were to paint it by hand with acrylic paint. Even with the same wash, if you want to push or accentuate the shadows even more, instead of just using it as a pin wash, you can also paint this area on top of the shadows, especially where you see the purple. Of course, don't forget the bolter arm. I can't count the amount of times I've ever forgotten about painting spare parts that I've left off the model. And there we go. It just takes a little bit of a lap and just cover the whole miniature. Now you've kind of let the oil, the pin wash to dry. It's a good idea to allow this to, sit there for at least half an hour. It just lets the paint kind of sit and some of the spirits to kind of dry out. But now you can see that I've taken the same brush, I've rinsed it, and I just have it damp with spirits, not soaking wet, but damp. And what we can do here, this is a good example of how I can clean up, a line that was too thick. That was I found that oil pin wash part too thicker on the neckline, and I'm just like gently just wiping the area dry, or I'm just carving off a piece that was too thick. The other most common parts that you're mostly gonna have to clean up is sometimes you get a little bit of blossoming of paint or oil paint around the rivets, and I just want more of I just want the shading to be hugging the very perimeter of the rivet. I don't want it to blossom out, so I will use a little bit of mineral spirit moist on my brush and just remove it there. So after the oil pin wash stage, I allow this to dry for 24 hours, and then after that is dry, I'll hit it with a matte varnish. And so I can start to begin again using acrylics. If we don't do a varnish there, you might run into the problem of your acrylic paints not sticking to the model very well. Here we're going to start in the palette on the top left, we're going to start highlighting all the black. The two paints I'm using here is a German Gray by Vallejo on the right, and then on the left is a medium gray by Vallejo again. I'm going to mix the German Gray and the medium gray to create another mixture there, which is around a 50-50 mix between German and medium gray, as well as both paints are thinned around a 1-to-1 mixture. Taking the German Gray now, I start applying the first highlight onto the black. A general rule of thumb is when I'm applying these highlights is I'm using the airbrush stage of the green as a general guide to where the lights should be positioned, as well as I'm looking at the figure and I'm looking at basically all the upwards facing planes that are facing towards the light, and that's where you're applying this first stage highlight. Another general trick to highlighting black is to just think of it as any other color. We don't necessarily have to leave everything absolute black, because when something is 100% black, that's more of an illustration of a complete devoid of light. Even black objects under light have a sort of gray to them, because there's light presence on top of the black object. So don't think that you just can't you just have to edge highlight black completely. If you really want the black to appear shinier, we just have to make the highlights smaller and smaller in size. But since this is on the armor, I'm not really thinking that this is a very shiny object, and it's pretty much more of the same material as is ceramite armor in some sense. So just a general highlight will do. Seeing this is the most precise painting section of the whole model. It's worth noting to take a little bit of an extra time. I know it's painting trim, and not everyone loves to paint trim, but this detail and the time you take here will pay off dividends to how clean or how crisp your painting is. Again, with that shape of the Mark III power armor on the trim of the shoulder pads, Take a look at the areas that I've used that I highlight to help bring that shape more to life and to accentuate its volume. Here, if you notice, especially along those curves, I don't bring that highlight all the way around the whole surface. I'm mainly keeping the highlight along the curvature that is more in line with the airbrush stage that we use to highlight the armor. Here's the first major large volumetric highlight on top of the backpack vents. So again, I'm just using, I can just use the lamp, or in this case, you can just paint the top half of the exhaust vent and make that all in the first stage highlight. Now here is where I take the 50-50 mixture of the medium gray and German gray, and I'll start to edge highlight on the trim here. The top of the trim is actually not a sharp edge, it's actually a rectangle, so there's a flat plane at the very top, and then two planes that go down on either side. So by using the side of your brush, we can edge highlight each side, each edge of that trim, and then I use the flat of my brush to align the top highlight and paint the top plane, and loosely try to align them to the same length, or to the same position where the highlight is on the shoulder. Again, most of the highlight is gathered towards the front of the face, as you can see with the direction that I did the shading with the airbrush. Most of the light is going to be gathered towards the front of the face, giving most of the attention. And running an edge highlight down the left side of our screen onto that centerpiece that divides the face between the left and the right. As well as positioning that highlight that kind of corresponds to where I brought the light on the chest with the green. And of course, since you saw the right side in normal speed, you'll get to see the other side and the rest of the model done, be it a little bit faster. All the same techniques, but you can also take note on the general positionings that I've placed each highlight. Of course, these secondary highlights, they just get smaller and smaller, so you just respect the boundary of the previous highlight, so you allow the first stage highlight to show, and bringing the second stage highlight closer to the peaks of the highlights or the peaks of the curves. Here's where I bring a little bit of light into the back. You can almost treat this as a rebounding highlight, and these are optional. Even especially for an army, you might not even see these, especially those highlights, those rebounding highlights, and don't feel bad if you wanted to skip them. But in relationship to how the size of the highlight itself, if you notice the ones in the rear or the ones I've placed in some of the shadows, they're much smaller in size, so it just gives the general illustration that there's a lot less light going down there. Here's where I take the same highlight and apply it on top of the exhaust ports. Again, respecting the size of the previous highlight and getting smaller as we move to the center, to the top of the object. If anything, that's the part that will show mostly of your paint consistency. So if you're painting with too thick a paint, you will see a harsher transition. But if you take that 1-to-1, or you might even want to make it 2 parts water to 1 part paint, you'll get a softer mark. Be it that you might have to do a second layer, but that's okay. Now we're moving on to highlighting the green. Basically just getting the same green mixture that I've done with the airbrush, be it that I've added more white into the mixture. And I'm going to proceed to give some edge highlights, first off by picking off the majority of the rivet details. This detail here, when we're moving into the face, is probably the most important. So I'm going to carefully take an edge highlight and rim the bottom, the upwards facing edge, so the bottom edge of the eyelid, as well as the little vent holes down below. Make sure that you don't just do an edge highlight around the whole circle of those vents. We just want to cover the bottom edge, or the edge that's facing upwards. This will just give it'll just reinforce the lighting scheme that the light is coming from above. All these little touches here all just help reinforce the idea of a unified key light source from above and help bring the model into a nicer view. Again, if you notice, even with the earpieces, I'm just keeping the highlights majority of the upward facing edges going from above. As well as using our highlights that we generated through the airbrush stage to help us guide us forward. This also applies when you're applying these rivets, so any of the rivets that are more facing upwards are definitely going to be covered, or are going to be hit with this highlight. Only in the most deepest recesses we won't bother on painting those highlights, as there's not much light for that rivet to catch. I think you can actually see a mistake there, which my brush accidentally hits the black highlight on the shoulder pad. Later will be corrected. Even I'm prone to slips of the brush here and there all the time. But I always like to say, painting is just a series of fixing mistakes. Here's an area where I actually break my rule. So on the lower half of the leg, those overlapping armor plates on the back, there's actually a section of downwards facing edges. I still edge highlight these just to give a little more volume into the leg and to help illustrate those plates a little bit more. Following, if you're gonna follow a rule by heart, it kind of can sometimes ruin you, or you know, not be as impactful on the painting. So sometimes you just have to make choices that, even though don't make total sense, but for the sake of the look of the model, and to please yourself, in terms of, if you think it looks good, you should always do what you think would look good at the end of the day. You know, even in this tutorial, or like when you're following lighting schemes and other theory on volume, you know, other like painted volumetric theory, it's, at the end of the day, it's what you think that looks really good, and because you're the painter, so, you know, follow your taste. Another thing you can do is, if you have downwards facing edges and you don't want to bring as much highlight, is just to mix a little bit of gray into that highlight, just so you tone it down a little bit. As you can see that I just did on the backpack there, those downward facing edges on the back of the backpack, I used that technique there, just to give a little bit of, just to still illustrate a little bit of more volume that an edge highlight does, so it shows off a little bit of detail, but it doesn't give it the same, I didn't give it the same emphasis as the brighter highlights of this color that I'm using right now. Now on the second stage highlight, I've just mixed a little more white into the paint, just to get some even brighter highlights, and that'll hug towards the top. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do some volumetric highlighting on the head and a little bit on the chest. This is optional, and for your line inventory you might not want to do it, or you might not see it, or if you've gone bright enough in your airbrush highlighting stage, it won't be necessary. But in this case, I felt like I wanted to bring a little more light into the front of his face. So here is where I changed the paint consistency to almost a glaze. So this is more like 3 parts water to 1 part paint. So I want to leave a very, very soft mark. And you pair that with very little charge in your brush. So when you pick up a little bit of paint, you're going to wipe off the majority, almost all of it. Almost think of it as your dry brushing, to remove a lot of the paint out of your bristles. But you'll notice there's still paint in your bristles there, and we can leave very, very soft marks just by doing a little bit of dots and stippling. And we can focus most of the highlight in those extreme areas that we want to accentuate. In this case of the model, in this one here, I'm only gonna do those little volumetric highlights just on the front of the head, that jaw area of the helmet. His right side of the chest, as you see here. And as well on the backpack. It's very high up in the model. I think it would catch a lot of light, so I'm just gonna add a little more to the top, as well as on the shoulder pads. This is you can also apply this on top of the freehand. This will kind of match. It'll help match out the light even more, and kind of give a little bit of just a little bit of a shine. Here I'm just feathering and just kind of like smoothing out a little bit. By the majority of my brush is just water with a little bit of paint at the end. Now don't forget the bolter. The nice thing is the bolter is almost exactly the same. Actually, literally it's the same as the black highlighting. So with the German gray, I'm first going off and just painting all the major volumes with it. keeping the brush really rough, and it's almost a bit like scribbling. It's a little bit almost messy. I don't want the bolter to appear as if it's like brand new. It's more a bit of like a gunmetal, and just allowing a little bit of the black primer to show through, as well as you pair that with the German gray that is mixed like 50-50 water to paint. You get you don't get a completely clean, like perfectly matted out bolter with German gray. And now we're just going to start highlighting it with the medium gray, the same types of highlights we're doing on the shoulder pads. Again, it's mostly highlighting the upwards facing edges, and then for the top, the flat parts of the bolter volumes, I would just cover that completely with that mixture. And you can always give a little bit of highlight, especially to the top rims of the bolter and the kick sight. The metallics, I've very limited metallics on this model, but nonetheless you still need them. I use the Vallejo model metallic series steel to paint the bolter, the barrel, the magazine, as well as these cables that are on the backpack. After that's applied, I'll take Games Workshop contrast paints, Airbrush Dunes, I think it's called, and it's kind of a yellowy brown contrast paint, but I found these contrast paints are wonderful for going on top of metallics, as it gives it a nice bit of a tint. It shades it really nicely, and it covers a little bit of it kind of shades some of the metallic pigment, so it gets knocked down a little bit. Yeah, it's nothing too fancy. I don't go crazy with the metallics at all. There's not a lot of areas to do it. But now we can just move straight on to the eyes. So after the undercoat of the eyes are painted black, we now will take Burnt Red by AK's AK 3rd generation acrylics, and we are going to paint the whole eye inside the red. If you can be careful, we want to leave the slightest sliver of black in the outline, if all do possible. Best thing to do is just take the sharpest brush that you have, and just be careful and take your time here. The mixture here next is, now I start adding white, so a white mixture with the burnt red, and now we're going to apply the first highlight into the eyes. Again, we want to aim in the middle, and then we can just always make it larger as we need it. And again, we want to respect the distance of the previous burnt red and have just a little bit of burnt red showing. It might take a couple of coats in order to get a nice opaque layer that we want. Just like that. Now we're going to moving on to the fluorescent paint, which is my favorite. This is Vallejo Airbrush Premium Color Scarlet. And there's no thing involved, just straight Scarlet, and I'm going to paint directly on top of that highlight that we just painted. The great thing about like neon paints in general is, they're very thin coverage, but once they hit something of a very high light value, that's where they really shine and really activate. But when they go over dark areas, it's notorious for poor coverage, but on these small areas it's perfect. Again, I'm going to take the same neon paint and make a dilution of about 50-50, just adding a bit of water into the paint there. And now I can just take that mixture and I'm going to coat the whole eye again with this thinned down version of this neon. But now I'm also going to brush over the highlights. So if you were, with the highlighting that you've done on the green under the eyes in particular, as long as you made that fairly neat, the nice thing is you already have a roadmap for your neon, and just by painting over the highlight, you already start to tint that highlight. And again, I've even stroked under the eyelid so it goes onto the black, and I'm going to follow that highlight on on the division of the face mask. And just after a second coat, so the first coat you don't really see much, but again it's the same properties, you know, subsequent layers gain in opacity. So after the second layer, now we can really start to see that that highlight has, the neon is really starting to come out. Now I'm just going to take some white, mix it with the neon, so we get a nice highlight. And then place it on the inner part of the eye, again respecting the previous layer so we can allow some of the previous colors to show through it. This is definitely a good time not to drink any coffee before you start doing this part. And then finally, more white is on the brush. And I can just dot the very center parts with white. And that's how you get the neon, the glowing eyes. This technique doesn't have to just be done with Scarlet. You can change it up and do any pretty much any neon color with those general stages in mind. Just swapping the colors for the equal colors and value. All right, now we're going to get into some weathering. So we're going to be doing weathering in a couple of stages. We're going to be doing some initial base weathering with acrylic paints, followed with the unification of the airbrush, and then we're also going to take some pigments, dry pigments, and we're also going to apply them onto here to give ourselves a little bit of a variety and you know, more information in general. The first stage here is we're going to be applying just creating some noise and some chips. The color that I have on the top left there is it's a close to a sunny skin tone of Vallejo, or it's light skin highlight. Any skin tone color will really do, because the general after we're going to be laying down some orange. I'm using a small dry brush from Artist Opus, but I don't want to use it as, you know, originally intended dry brush. I really want to use this as a pattern brush to get a bunch of stipples down at once. You could of course use, you know, a fine detail brush and do one dot at a time, but using these dry brushes, here's the extra small version, it allows us to put a bunch of dots on at once, so you're not painstakingly doing dot, you know, one dot at a time. You see me do like a few errors. Oops, there's way too much paint. Just be careful when you're doing this is to wipe off a little bit of the paint on your brush, as well as when you are touching the model, you just need to graze it. You don't need to like push your bristles into there like I accidentally did. Don't worry, it happens sometimes. Luckily, it's not this technique is not very punishing for those types of mistakes. As long as you're not just every single touch is like that, you'll be fine. And then now we're going to get to the airbrush stage. So what I have on here is a burnt orange by AK, and we're going to be making a glaze in our airbrush. This is like 4 to 5 parts airbrush thinner, so the acrylic thinner, to 1 part paint, and we're just going to do a very, very thin mixture into here into the airbrush. And now we're going to be applying very gently into directly on top of the stages where we've done some of that stippling. Again, just with the nature of this really thin paint, the first layer we're just really looking for it to get wet and to start seeing the staining that's going to be happening. But what we don't want to do, of course, is to continually to flood the same area that is wet, because we'll just get runs and a poor coverage and poor build. Just moving around the model and mostly using the airbrush to dry the area. I will do several passes over all of the legs, and just watching out is because, remember, when it's wet, it'll look very different from when it's drying. So do a thin layer, let it dry, and then you can kind of see the impact that each layer has, and slowly work your way up and build it up accordingly. You can also use the airbrush. I'm going to use it to apply a little bit of that color on the undersides of the arms, a little bit partway up into a little bit of his lower groin area, and even on the backs, the back parts of the shoulder pads, and maybe a little bit into the backpack. Oh, even into the little bits of just little shots of the gun. It's nice because this paint is not very staining very hard, and it just tints the area ever so slightly. When I'm doing weathering, I generally like to couple a few techniques together rather than just relying on either A, this acrylic, or B, just weathering pigments. The more variety and the more information I find looks more interesting and just more detailed. There you go, just taking a look around to make sure I've covered all the angles that I wanted to. And now we get into, before we start doing the pigments, we'll just quickly cover the base. Just using some of this acrylic paste from AK Scenics. This is like light earth. You can always add like little bits of rock and stuff like that into the base, but for this demonstration, I just coat the whole base with this textured paint. I prime it, and then I give it an airbrush coat of Model Color Earth from Vallejo Model Color. Now we're going to make a pigment wash, which is really fun. So the first thing we need is this red brick. We're going to take a little bit of this pigment here, and then what I'm putting out here is just water. No thinner, just all you need is water. And you're going to be adding water and mixing this pigment together in this small little dish. And the fun, deceptive thing is it looks like a very matte liquid, which is kind of strange because, you know, it's a liquid that doesn't really shine. And that's like the kind of consistency we want to get. And what we can do now is we can take this wash and we can apply it like a very, very messy version of our oil pin wash. So if the pin wash we were trying to be, you know, more accurate and just get the wash to flow just in the crevices, instead we're just using this as a heavy wash, and I will concentrate the majority of my brush strokes in the crevices and places where I think, you know, dirt and everything would get lodged into, but I'm more free to allow that to expand a little bit outwards onto the rest of the armor plating. Of course, the closer I get to the ground, the closer I get to the feet is where I will lay it down heavily, and as we move up the model, that's where I'll start to apply it more like the oil pin wash that we did earlier in the video. Another advantage to doing a pigment wash like this is I find that it's a lot much more accurate and a lot easier, a lot less messier to apply it than doing the dry method. You can experiment with both, but what I find, especially when I'm painting infantry like this, where I have to be a little more delicate, I want to be more selective in the areas I want to paint, or I want to apply this pigment, having it loose and chalky can kind of get everywhere. It can get on your fingers, and then, or it might get into areas of the model that you don't want it to, and even though it's drying, you can kind of brush it off. The cleanup can be a bit of annoying and a bit of a mess. But I find when it's in a wash form like this, it's easier to place, and you can also put it in the little cracks of armor like you're showing here. So just being very gentle on the last parts, as I said before, as you move upward, up towards the um, higher parts of the model, we want to have less of it showing. That way we get this, we get a general story sense of the mud and or the battlefield is caked with this heavy dirt that mostly is on the lower hemisphere of the model, and but still parts from above still get a little bit of this, get a little bit of the this kind of like Martian kind of orangey red. And again, I'll apply this onto the base as well. It's worth noting that when you apply this, remember, once the water dries and evaporates, all it will leave is the pigment, and it'll look almost like dusty. And to finally make it so it's easy to handle as a gaming piece, I've just taken a pipette and I filled it with some mineral spirit, and I am just putting little bits, dropping it little bits onto the model, and once that's dry, it'll help to fix the pigment into place, so it's easier to handle. And there we have it. Just over an hour, we have a finished Sons of Horus Space Marine. Thanks again for joining me all the way through, and I really hope that this tutorial has helped you paint your own Marines, or applying these techniques to a Legion of your choice. I'm going to leave you here with a short slideshow of the finished Marine, as well. If you stick around to the end, I will be showing you guys the process on how I came up with the Sons of Horus Green that you can use as a process for coming up with your own future paint schemes. Alright, if you made it this far, it means you're interested in seeing my color process for coming up with this Sons of Horus Green. This theory and these practices can also be used to come up with your other combinations for any other Legion or any other project you see fit. But it all really starts down to bringing out a few key colors in order what I want to work with when you're thinking about your project. In this case, the Sons of Horus Green is very much a blue-green, or what's described as that. So when getting out these colors, I want to grab colors that have a little bit of blue, a little bit of green in there, as well as grabbing a color that really goes towards the green side, and then bringing in another color that just contains blue. And what you're trying to do is trying to find a happy medium. So by going through the rack, I selected a few colors down here. So I got like the AK's ocean blue in the middle. Right is the phalo green, so that's my pure green choice. And then I have a blue green, which is almost like a lighter version of ocean blue. And then to complete the full blue side, I have a pastel blue, and then I have a pastel yellow, which I will want to use to lighten everything up, as well as a white and a black. Now, the real reason why I put them on the palette here is because I find color works best is when you work with it. It's not enough just to look at your paint rack and try to imagine, what kind of color you want to create. It's much better to actually put the colors you want to work with on the palette and just start moving them around. Because also, we make the best color choices when colors are next to each other, side by side. Colors works as much more as a relationship tool rather than colors on their own. So when this pastel blue is right up against the phalo green, for instance, we get a different feeling, rather if we just look at the pastel blue in a vacuum on its own. As well as when we put them on the palette, it's much easier, and it's much easier to work more quicker or more spontaneous and go by feeling, especially when the paint is down on the palette. We can just simply grab the paint with our mixing brush and start mixing. Rather, if we just wait to put them on the, from the bottles onto the palette, you have to shake it, put it on the palette, then mix it. That's a little bit of time, and it can kind of slow your process down. For here, I find this a much more intuitive experience. And, again, I just like to play with colors. And also, don't think of this as like wasting paint. You know, there's actually going to be 2 paints that I put down on here, which you're going to see in this process, that I don't even touch. I don't see this as a waste of paint. More so is I got to see them on the palette, and I got to see them in relationships to the other colors I'm building. It's not necessarily for me to, I need to use all these colors, is I need to use these colors to discover the right color, if that makes sense. So after I start mixing some of this ocean blue and phthalo green, when I start adding that pastel yellow, this is where I kind of get the eureka moment. I was like, that's the color I want to grab. That's the color I want to generate. I think that's really cool because especially with a little bit of that pastel yellow, I'm kind of using that as a high value color to kind of simulate a warmer light that's being casted upon the model. That's it. And then, you know, for final highlights, you can always add a little bit of white, just for process sakes. As I'm adding here, I just put a little bit of white and a little bit of black onto here. And now, since I have like that general color that I'm finding, now I'm gonna start playing around by desaturating a color. So remember, when you're adding black and white, those are not colors. So the more black or the more white we add in here, we're gonna be pulling color away. So we're gonna be desaturating the color. This is mostly helpful because in shadows and highlights, this is exactly just that. You're desaturating those areas. But by adding more pastel yellow into your highlights before you go to white, you can raise the lightness, the value of the current color without losing too much color in itself. And then saving just adding white for the very max highlights. So now, you know, you're just gonna see me play with a few of the colors. I'm making a few of the swatches and just coming up with the shadows and then the base tone, and then what I want to use as general highlight. And from there, yeah, again, like I said, I don't touch the pastel blue or the blue green. I just use them as a gauge. And there you have it. That's pretty much the process on how I came up with the Sons of Horus Green, and more importantly, a general process on how I come up and play with color combinations to come up with my own. Thanks again for joining me on the painting the Sons of Horus Space Marine. I hope you found this tutorial helpful in painting your own, or even taking the techniques and workflow into your own Legion projects. If you enjoyed this, please consider to like and subscribe, as the feedback is appreciated and lets me know that you found the content useful. And finally, if you want to view more of my painting tutorials, consider joining me on the Pro Palette, my own website, where I host more in-depth painting tutorials and brush foundation instruction, as well as access to the Pro Palette Discord. All the best, and happy painting!